Well, thank you, Danielle, and I hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to start by thanking Danielle and my other friends at IRIS for putting all of this together and for giving me the opportunity to join in. It is my first experience giving a seminar talking to the ether without any actual faces looking back at me, which is kind of strange. On the other hand, you all can't see how badly I need a haircut right now, so that's a plus. I was invited to give a talk about my international work, and so what I put together is kind of a grab bag that's a mix of science and then some thoughts on capacity development, and we'll see how it goes. So just a few thoughts on international seismology. For an IRIS audience, some of this doesn't need to be said, that seismology is a global field, that's a big duh, and that there's important seismotectonic structure issues that we need and want to sort out. Within a USGS context, the USGS does not have any funding or mandate to work on international hazards, so it's more of a question that comes up, why we're working internationally, and there's a number of answers to that that I think the IRIS audience knows well. That a big earthquake anywhere teaches us about big earthquakes everywhere. There's important work that we can do with technical assistance and capacity development. Sometimes science serves U.S. strategic interests, what you can call science diplomacy, and that's an important role that our community can play. And then responding to international earthquakes keeps key technical capabilities battle tested, because we don't fortunately have that many big earthquakes in the US that we need to respond to. Okay, so the outline of the talk, I was going to go over the projects that I've led in Haiti, Nepal, and Myanmar, and then talk more specifically about capacity development and this bit about making our broader impact deeper. So let me start with the 2010 Haiti earthquake. After big earthquakes strike around the world, there's a phenomenon where the media go out and they focus on the most dramatic damage because that's the news. They don't necessarily give you a sense of the representative damage, and in a lot of cases, the impression that you get watching the media is really kind of distorted by the media's role, and people get the impression that the impact of an earthquake is worse than it is in a lot of cases. Haiti, sadly, was an exception to that. It really did feel and look that bad when you were there in person. Here's a few postcards, but there were just images like this all over Port-au-Prince. The image on the lower left, that was next door to the house that our group rented for our first field visit in March of 2010. It was a well-constructed private home that didn't have any damage that we could see, and at one point I thought to climb the stairs outside and look over the fence, and that's what I saw, the building next door. So that kind of damage was just ubiquitous throughout Port-au-Prince. So the project that I led was what we call an Earthquake Disaster Assistance Team, or EDAT, project supported by USAID, and all of the work that I'm talking about was supported by USAID/AFTA. So we had a team of partners, including some USGS colleagues who you can see here, and then we were partnering with the Haitian Bureau of Mines and Energy and some of the individuals you can see here also. So the project had two parts. One part of it was focused on collection of geological data, looking at the faults to try to understand what had happened, and I wasn't involved with that. I'm not talking about that at all. Then there was an aftershock deployment to collect the aftershock data. That had two parts. One was involved RevTechs around the epicentral region focused on improving aftershock locations. The other part was a deployment of strong motion instruments around Port-au-Prince. Oops, Port-au-Prince, that's a bad typo. to look at site response, and that was the Port-au-Prince deployment was the focus of my involvement on the ground. It started life as a very classic site response deployment. So what you're looking at is, this is the, whoops, don't do that. This is the Port-au-Prince region. It's overlain by a damage map that was determined by remote sensing imagery, but you can see the mountainous spine of the of southern Haiti. And then, so we had a classic sort of site response line with a reference station, 2 stations in the foothills, 2 stations in the alluvial valley, the former marine environment, and then 1 station by the coast. And I had an expectation going in that this was going to be, sort of the Nimitz Freeway experiment all over again, that it would show the amplification at the sedimentary sites. Instead, the data, as soon as they started coming in, were a surprise. Looking at the line, we're seeing, for some events, not all, strong amplification at the foothill sites, more than the ones in the valley. So skipping the details and cutting to the chase, the conclusion is that it's a classic example of topographic amplification. If you take the damage map and drape it over Google Earth topography, you can see how this swath of damage, including, this is a ridge, follows the ridge that the Hotel Montana sits on top of. We had another station by chance that was along this topography, so we could really look at the details of the ground motion effects. And then, so there was the first cut results that came out of the first few events that we recorded. Eventually, the synoptic study was led by Cedric St. Fleur, published in BSSA. I think it was 2016 actually, but he looked at the full data set and did a nice job of characterizing the site response and modeling it. And then the other part of the aftershock deployment, that the synoptic study was also led by a Haitian student, in that case at Purdue, working with Eric Calais. There was a nice study that came out in 2013, and that study helped to sort out the details of the Mainshock Rupture, which had been somewhat enigmatic from the beginning. So one of the lessons, I'm going to sort of keep a running stock on the lessons learned, and in this case, a lesson was there's no substitute for data, which again doesn't need to be said, I think. But there were some assumptions going in, and when that earthquake happened, that the earthquake had happened on the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault. Sorry, typos are us today. And that ground motions in Port-au-Prince had been exacerbated by site response. And instead, what we found was a more complicated story. I just wanted to show this picture also. This is actually a strong motion recording of the main shock. This is a battery rack in a cell phone facility that was, the bolt broke and it went sliding across the floor and left a track on the floor. So there were no conventional strong motion records. This is one. The question obviously is the instrument response. This was an interesting project in that it was, to a large extent, going back to first principles to try to sort out what that can tell us about the ground motions. There was a nice formalism worked out by Taniguchi and Miwa 2008, who looked at the forward problem of how a rigid body moves in response to sinusoidal shaking. So these are the closed form solutions. Basically, the movement, the displacement depends on the friction, the predominant period, and the peak acceleration. So you can turn that around, and so we know the displacement, we can guess at the friction, we can guess at the predominant period, and then you can actually get a semi-quantitative estimate of PGA, which turned out to be between about 40% and 60% G. So the lesson there is that data comes in all shapes. Data come in all shapes and sizes, and not always from a computer. So let me move on to Nepal, it is, and I am finding that talking to the ether is funny. I'm not sure my pacing is right. And I'm sorry that there's no ability to jump in with questions, but I'm certainly happy to take questions at the end. So in Nepal, I think that's a earthquake that people are familiar with. So the earthquake nucleated west of the Kathmandu Valley. The rupture propagated unilaterally to the east, essentially directly under Kathmandu Valley. When I first heard that it was a 7.9 in Nepal in that location, my heart fell to the floor. This was the nightmare scenario that a lot of people had worried about. It's essentially a direct hit on the mega city of Kathmandu, and you can see the cross section here again, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with from Gavin Hayes et al. So images started to come out, like this one taken by Brian Collins, documenting the very heavy damage in some of the remote villages. And then in the national media, there were a lot of images of spectacular damage to cultural heritage sites in the Kathmandu Valley. There were articles that Nepal's cultural heritage had been destroyed. These are just a couple of the relatively dramatic pictures that I took. This was an example where what you saw through the media was not a good indication of the overall situation. About 5 weeks after the earthquake, I flew in for the first time after the earthquake, and this was the view out the window. So if you look at this, if you look closely, you can find some evidence of damage. There's some tents down here, but overwhelmingly it's a sea of intact buildings, and this was a shock to see. I'd seen it before the earthquake, and I just would not have imagined it would look like that afterwards. And very fortunately for the impact. Driving around Kathmandu Valley, at one point I decided to take some pictures, but this was a typical scene. There were some spectacular instances of damage in a few places, but overwhelmingly, you just wouldn't know an earthquake had happened. The biggest difference between what it looked like before was that the traffic was a whole lot lighter because a lot of people had gone home to be with their families in remote villages. But you can get a sense here of what the local construction is like. And this is actually, I think, some of the better built buildings. A lot of them are worse than this in terms of quality. And there just wasn't a big impact. Another picture that's worth 1,000 words. This is a private home in the southern Kathmandu Valley. It's a well-built home, but again, it's right on top of a magnitude 7.9 earthquake. And the owner told me that nothing fell except for one knickknack that was perched on a windowsill. Okay, so in terms of intensity studies, macroseismic data, that's barely intensity 5 in this location. So the lesson here is that there's no substitute for boots on the ground and eyeballs. I don't want to make light of the disaster that happened. There were over 9,000 fatalities. There was a heavy impact on some villages and in a lot of respects. But the way some characterizations of the damage are just at odds with the view that you got on the ground. So moving along, in that case, we did have some instrumental recordings of the main shock, not as much as we would have liked. There's the famous USGS catnip record that you may know. There was a strong motion record nearby from the Department of Mines and Geology that was pushed out the door pretty much as soon as they could manage. Then there were 4 stations that in Kathmandu that were a site response deployment, including a reference site. It took a while for those data to be available. There is a study that I'll come back to by Sudhir Rajaure et al. Published just this year. There was GPS data and then regional strong motion data. So this is the catnip record, which was pushed out as quickly as it was retrieved by John Galecka. It's such a, so this is, you're looking at one component of acceleration integrated to displacement, and it's such an oddball record that, you know, a lot of people were keen to look at it, but there were questions about whether or not the instrument had functioned properly. So one of the things I did, May 26, 2015, was visit the station with John Galecka. We took out the original instrument so that I could tilt test the initial instrument. We replaced it with a new unit. The original catnip now lives someplace else in Kathmandu. But that record, so we verified that there weren't any instrumentation problems. The catnip recording of the main shock provided the first indication, looking at the predominant period of shaking over the first few minutes. This provided the first indication that there had been a pervasively nonlinear response of the sediments in the valley, and so this will serve to do two things. It'll shift the dominant period of response, but it will also de-amplify the high frequencies. So looking in more detail, the data that are analyzed by Rajaure et al. This shows the spectral ratios relative to the reference site, and you can see for the main shock and then a large aftershock, but just focus on the main shock for now. There's amplification below about 1.7, 1.8 hertz, and then fairly strong de-amplification at frequencies higher than around 2 hertz. And what was going on here was an absolutely key part of the story for the damage and for Kathmandu Valley, because the Kathmandu Valley is full of buildings that looks, you know, more or less like this. They're obviously not the most resilient structures in the world. They're going to be vulnerable in general, but vulnerable to shaking, to high frequency shaking. And that was the energy that fortunately was de-amplified. So little buildings like this, as vulnerable as they were just along for the ride with this long period basin response. For this earthquake, the macroseismic data was a critical resource because the instrumental data were so sparse. This plot is the intensity map that was produced. It was really Stacy Martin's Herculean effort to pull intensity information out of media accounts and other information in the early aftermath from over 1,000, it's over several thousand locations. So start to build up a map of the shaking distribution. Subsequently, we worked, so we being a cast of characters, including Stacy and then our colleagues in Nepal, on a synthesis of intensity data, pulling together a number of intensity studies that had been done by different groups, including a building damage assessment project that was led by locally by my colleagues at NSET, the National Society for Earthquake Technology. That involved a building survey of hundreds of thousands of buildings that were carefully interpreted to determine intensity data. So we put that data together with pretty much everything available to produce this map. It is just released and described in a earthquake spectra article that just came out a couple of months ago. So this is sort of hot off the presses, and I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about it because it might be of interest. This region here is the estimate of the Mainshock Rupture perimeter, and that comes from an early study by Lindsay et al. So you'll see that reproduced in the next few slides. So this is intensity. There were a couple of preliminary results that came out of the intensity study. So this was the Martin et al. Study. One was that you could see evidence of de-amplification in Kathmandu Valley. This isn't the best slide to show it. But then there was evidence that the highest intensities were along the northern edge of the rupture, which a number of people commented on and interpreted as evidence that the high frequency radiation, which is controlling the intensities in this case, was really being radiated preferentially from this down dip part of the rupture. And that seemed to fit nicely with the back projection results. These are from Ling Seng Men's work that showed that the high frequency radiation was preferentially radiated along the down dip edge. Well, so that was the conclusions that came out of the preliminary intensity map. If you look at the more authoritative synthesized map, you get this view. So what I've done now, and let me go back. Yeah, so this one is, you can, once you have the intensities, you can calculate residuals to look at the variability of shaking. So I should have said that. These are intensity residuals now. So red in this figure is intensity 2 units higher than the average. And I'm not going to, you can quibble about how average is defined, but I'm not going to worry about that. For this figure also, I'm plotting residuals. So red is 2 units higher than average. Bluish is average, and then going down to purple and deep blue is deamplification. And I don't show you the actual data points on this map. I should, but there's quite a few of them. And so the nonlinearity really, that result came into sharper focus. The Kathmandu Valley is within this boxed region. You can see how low the shaking intensities are. And if you drape that part of the map again over Google Earth topography, you can see that the central part of the valley, where a lot of us expected the amplification to be the worst, actually had the lowest shaking intensities. Going around to the periphery, you start to get higher intensities that are a combination of effects. You're getting away from the nonlinearity, but you're also starting to get, in some cases, topographic amplification. So that result came into focus. The high frequency radiation and damage pattern was a little more complicated. In the synthesis map, the highest residuals are not actually along the northern edge, where, to be honest, we don't have a huge number of data points. That's the high Himalayan range, but that the highest intensities are actually along the middle of the rupture. So if people are interested in source radiation and high frequency radiation, this is a kind of hot off the press data set that you're welcome to contact me for if you're interested. So one of the lessons learned there, and I'm not really summarizing the scientific lessons, but the first cut results are important. We're all scrambling to get them out, but they are only the first cut, and probably that doesn't need to be said either. Okay, so Myanmar, continuing the Magical Mystery Tour. This started in 2012. It was a different sort of project in the sense that it wasn't driven by an earthquake. It was really part of the overall US diplomatic initiative to reach out to Myanmar and to be more engaged with their government as they were making important changes. So we were able to start with a needs assessment, partnering with the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology, or DMH, and ask them what were their priorities for a capacity development technical assistance project. They identified really 2 things: upgrading their seismic network, which existed but really not in a modern form. They had a few seismometers, but there was no data telemetry. There was no real-time analysis. There was hardly any internet connectivity. And then training, just sort of from the ground up. So that was a project that we focused on at the beginning. Looking back, I was wildly naive about what would be involved and how long it would take. But it came to fruition in January 2016 with the upgrade of the seismic network, including installation of 5 modern broadband and strong motion stations with data telemetry to the network hub with upgraded software. All through the project, training has been a big part of the effort. starting really as soon as the network was installed, it started to expand. I'll talk about that. And then training, and more training. So again, the focus is squarely on capacity development. And just a few postcards from the field. One of the challenges was data telemetry. It was actually a massive challenge of how we were going to, what technologies we were going to use. The cellular networks were and are in a period of very rapid development, from formerly restricted access to much more open and just much better networks. So one of the trips was to scope out whether or not it would be viable to use cellular telemetry. And then vault construction at a couple of the stations was necessary. We ended up partnering with some very capable folks at RIMES in Bangkok. So there were a couple of new vaults built, and then a couple of existing WWSSN era vaults that we were able to use at other stations. Then the actual installations, the hardware and the software, we were working with Kinemetrics under contract. So that happened in January 2016. And then the network performance, there were a whole lot of things that I lost sleep over. In all of this, data telemetry probably topping the list, but things have worked very well since the initial installation. This is a map that shows the earthquakes recorded just over the initial 18 months, and then there's circles showing 300-kilometer radii around the different stations, but you can get a sense of how high the seismicity rate is, and since this figure was created, we've had a number of other significant earthquakes. So the data rate has been, for better or mostly for worse, high. In June of 2017, the network software was expanded to provide real-time shake map capabilities. So now when any significant earthquake happens, the network creates an automatic shake map using the system that the USGS uses. And I should say that I've heard some people talk about a quote USGS network. We were never looking to expand a USGS network or develop a USGS network in Myanmar. It is not a USGS network. It's a DMH run Myanmar national network. The code is MM. So this isn't a USGS operation. The shake maps that are produced at this point are better than what the USGS produces because they're not, the USGS NEIC is not using most of data from most of the stations. So the DMH really is the authoritative reporting agency for local earthquakes. Okay, so moving on, one of the really gratifying parts of this project has been watching our little network grow kind of organically. So the Indian government, via a project that the acronym is INCWA, installed a number of new stations, and they're actually in the process of installing 4 or 5 more. They contribute their data to the network. It comes in real time. It's shared with IRIS, and so it's contributing to the shake maps that are produced. China, the CEA, has 2 stations that contribute data to the network, although not, I think, to IRIS. And then there's some others out there. We bring in the Thai stations and 1 or 2 Indian stations, but there's a couple of others that help flesh out the network. And so this is critically important for the DMH to improve their locations and their shake maps after significant earthquakes. So this network exists. If there's other stations that have telemetry, people are welcome to work with us to bring that data into the fold. Okay, so this is just sort of a summary of how that's progressed. The project has progressed. It took longer than expected. I think it's like remodeling your house. The lesson one of the big lessons was that everything takes longer than you think. And then through all this project, and especially now that the instruments are in, there's a major focus on training. And a shout out to Emily Wallen, who's been working on the project since June of 2016. She's been a huge part of the project. And the training that we've been doing, which I'll talk about more in a second. So how am I doing on time? I can't see my computer clock, but okay. So the lessons learned there, the real lesson was everything takes longer than you think, but probably people know that. So now let me talk about capacity development and what I mean by making broader impact deeper. Okay, so capacity development in NSF parlance is referred to as broader impact of the science-focused project, and I think we all know the kind of activities that includes: field training for partners, training workshops, potentially bringing students into outside master's or PhD programs, potentially doing hazard assessments to improve the hazard assessment for a region. These are the typical activities. But so let me talk first about field training. And this is the part where I might find out how many people I can piss off in with one slide. But this is something that I wanted to say, that when we go into a country, we partner with local professionals. We look to them to handle the local logistics. If a partnership boils down to local partners doing all the logistics and the outside team doing all the science, that's not capacity development, it's imperialism. Okay, we're scientists. We see ourselves as fundamentally different from the classic imperialist types who crash into a country looking to exploit the mineral resources or the teak forests or whatever. But first cut science is a commodity that is limited, and the local scientists and professionals in a country really would like a crack at doing that work themselves. So I think sometimes the scientific community, we need to think about how we're working in other countries with our international partners. There are some hugely successful capacity development programs, I know, so I don't mean to be scolding everybody out there. But I've heard people say things like, we can't involve a local researcher in our team, we don't have time to bring them up to speed. Or, well, there's only so much we can do with training, there isn't enough local capacity to even build on. And I don't think that's acceptable. And at a minimum, if that is your approach to doing science, you can't call it capacity development. It's doing science. So okay, that was my big soapbox speech for the day. For field training to be effective, it needs to be sustained, it needs to be focused. You need to work with the local earthquake professionals with heavy involvement. It needs to be hands-on, having computers and instruments in their hands, not just them looking over shoulders. Moving on to workshops, we all love workshops, they're very useful. But there is a major danger of the death by PowerPoint pitfall. So let me talk a little bit about workshops. You need to know your audience. If you come in with a training that's appropriate for a beginning graduate level, it might sail right over everybody's head if they don't have enough background to follow. You need to know what other training has been done in the region. Have other people done similar trainings, what's been covered, what hasn't been covered. You need to quickly move beyond concepts and conceptual training to training and workshops that involve actual hands-on tools. A conceptual training in probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, is, for example, is dead easy, or basic seismology, and most of us can do that in our sleep. But it's only going to go so far in terms of capacity development. What people really need are the tools to start, and hands-on training to start to put things into use. We need partner-led investigations where, you know, our partners really are doing the work, not just us from outside, as opposed to the, as happens with a, quote, grab the data and run approach. Okay, so a few slides on how things went in the activities in Haiti, ran the gamut from various kinds of training, etc., outreach. Our partners there were very keen to develop an outreach program working with schools and the media and officials. And so we were providing tools to them so that they could be effective in this role. And if you see the picture on the left, I flat out guarantee you that those young women would not have been half as rapt as if I had been giving the talk instead of my Haitian colleague, Jean-Robert Altidore. Okay, so they moved on to issuing their own press releases. This is a terrible slide, but in local language, working with their media and so forth. In Nepal, the activities there, it's been a range of activities, actually going back to 2009 when I led a small workshop that was focused on PSAJ tools. And then more recently, the workshops have focused on some of the tools of the trade, including Linux, GMT, SAC. Emily Wallen was involved with this 2016 workshop as well. So this is the moving beyond death by PowerPoint, and you know, to really focus on some of the what might be some basic needs and gaps, working with international partners. You know, they may not be familiar with Linux or GMT or SAC or all of these great tools that are out there. Okay, I'm speeding up somewhat because it just took longer than I thought, but I'm getting to the end. So in Myanmar, it's again, we focused heavily on, pretty much exclusively on capacity development and training. Figuring out what the needs and the gaps are. We have a partner agency with very capable junior staff in particular. They've got strong undergraduate backgrounds, but it's in mathematics or computer science or physics. And if you think about all the things that we all first got exposed to in graduate school, you know, they haven't necessarily seen that before. Time series analysis, what's spectral analysis, regressions, maybe linear algebra, plus these tools of the trade that we all sort of learned in kindergarten, but other people may not be familiar with. So, you know, you start, it's brick by brick, recognizing what the needs are and addressing those. Okay, so if you follow me on social media, I'm SeismoSue on Twitter. You've seen a lot of pictures like this. The green wall is the famous green wall is the DMH office in Naypyidaw, and this is the famous Emily Wallen, who has been an absolutely critical part of the work that we're doing. These are our colleagues at the DMH working on the batteries at the station in Yangon. Oops, there. Okay, so making the broader impact deeper, it means working with local professionals, understanding what the needs are and addressing those, and making everything as hands-on as possible. A part of that can be training for students in outside programs. There have been some wonderful success stories from Haiti. So this is the famous Robbie and Steve that Eric Calais recruited to Purdue. They've both now finished PhD programs. Cedric St. Fleur, who did a PhD in France, he's the one who did the analysis of the site response data. Sophia Ulysses is, I believe, finishing up her PhD now in Belgium. And so some of these studies have come out with Haitian individuals as first authors, and so these now are a small cadre of professionals who are able to contribute to future work. There is, with students, there is the issue and the bias with, certainly with USAID. They're not big on supporting students because the line is, once they're trained in an outside university, they won't go back. And I know that's short-sighted. Of even if a student doesn't go back, they are an important, vital link to the local community. But it is a resistance that you're going to run into. So so the concluding thoughts are on what's really needed for sustainable risk reduction in other countries. And there's a lot of things that come to mind when we think about this. How do we contribute to risk reduction in a country like Haiti or Nepal? We might work on the seismotectonic framework to sort out what's going on. We might improve the slip rate estimates on major faults, which is a critical ingredient for PSHA maps. Or we might improve the PSHA maps directly. There's a list of things that we think of as contributing to risk reduction, and they do. But I think it's very instructive to look at what happened in California. There's a story that we all, I think, know well, that the 1933 Long Beach earthquake led within weeks to the enactment of the Field Act, that people saw the damage to local schools, which were fortunately mostly empty at the time, but that was the impetus for major legislative action. For the Field Act is not a building code, but it's requirements, strict requirements for the building of any public K-12 school in California. But editors tell you to avoid the passive tense, and there was a passive tense in what I just said, that, well, the Field Act, this was enacted. The Field Act did not just happen. The earthquake did not just make that happen. Things happened because there was political leadership, but there was also a community of local earthquake professionals. Some of the names McElwain, Charlie Richter, Gutenberg. This was the community that was at Carnegie and Caltech at the time of the earthquake. There were earthquake engineers. There were professionals who were already working on understanding the earthquake problem and communicating that. And so when the earthquake happened, when there was that moment of opportunity, things happened because local professionals were there to make it happen. So the concluding thoughts, and I believe this is the very last slide, is just, maybe I don't need to reiterate some of the things I've said, but when we're thinking about sustainable risk reduction, I think the most important thing we can do is provide whatever support we can for the local earthquake professionals, including people working at institutions as well as potentially students. They, not we, will be the agents of change in their countries over the long run. They, not we, have the wherewithal to make things happen, working within their own governments and societies. They, not we, are the ones who live there. And with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. I think that was an amazing presentation. Feel free to write your questions into the questions part of the control panel, and I'll be reading them out loud. Our first question is from Shiba Subedi, and he or she asks, oh, okay, it's somebody that you know, good. In Nepal, do you have any scheduled training programs?
That's a great question. So can people hear my answer or only you?
No, everyone can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, well, duh, you heard the talk. Okay, I just wasn't sure how the Q&A.
Yeah, no, you're fine. Everyone can hear you.
Okay, are we doing any training? We had a planned training that got postponed last year. We're we are hoping to be there in June. But I put my email on this slide if people can see it. And so that's a great question to send me by email so I can send you more details.
Yeah, yeah. That's somebody that I can get the email information and follow up with. If that's yeah.
Okay, I can't hear the questioner, so that's the right.
Right. I can follow up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Panina Miller just wanted to let you know that there's 9 people at Pascal watching. So yeah,
Oh,
that was using one link.
hi.
So shout out to the Pascal group. And Steve Jamais just kind of had to run to another talk, but was just still amazed at how we're kind of all still using like SAC, which is like a 1990s type software, and things like that. Which, yeah, I mean, I agree that we are still kind of using some things, but I know that Emily, for instance, has been really changing, moving over to things like Python and OBSPy and
Yeah, no, Emily is a Python goddess, and and I'm sort of convinced that it's got amazing capabilities. SAC has been unbelievably durable as somebody who was around when it was first introduced and understood the need for QDP off. You just it's hard to believe that it's been that durable, but it is, sometimes the tools that we're using are kind of at the wrong level for a basic training. And so SAC, just for the intuitive, what are you doing? It really has been useful for that. There have been some issues if you're trying to use it for a training. You have to install it potentially on Windows machines, and that brings up a whole host of challenging technical issues. But yeah, I mean, sometimes the basic tools really can be useful.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. So Sue, I'll ask my own question as people are still kind of writing in things. That you talked a lot about like the technical lessons learned and the broader impacts of things of how to build capacity within a country. It's like that whole like teach a man to fish kind of concept. Um, but what do you think is your like on a personal level? What do you think is your biggest lesson learned from all of your travels and from everywhere that you've gone and built capacity and worked with people? What do you think you've learned? What's the biggest lesson you've learned?
Thank you. That's a great question, and maybe I should have said this. I have learned that there are amazing people everywhere. And Haiti was the real eye-opener, because what you hear about Haiti, it's demonized. You hear that there's no educated professionals. Everyone who gets a degree leaves. There's the tiny elite, and then nobody else has an education. It's just wrong. That there are capable professionals, there's teachers, there's engineers, there are amazing people who deal with more on a day-to-day basis than most of us ever see. And I've told a story of walking a mile literally in the shoes of an average Haitian during the granddaddy of all traffic jams. And it's a story that I'm going to end up telling my grandchildren because it was so epic. But people in Haiti, they are more resilient and more resourceful than most of us ever see and that most of us can ever imagine. And it's true everywhere that working with our partners in Myanmar, in Nepal, they may not have the educational backgrounds that we do, but the level of commitment and energy, the basic capabilities of people and human resources never fails to amaze and impress me.
Thank you, Sue. That's a wonderful answer. And Emily also had a chance to write in and just said she likes to say that SAC is her Swiss Army knife and Python is her toolbox. So, so yeah. Okay, well, that concludes our questions for today. Sue, thank you so much. I'll get you in touch with that first question person who asked.
Okay.
And yeah, and if again, this is recorded and will be set up by the end of the day. Oh, wait, one question did come in. See, this is what happens. Shiba also asks, he said, very nice presentation. One more question. Could you please give more details about the Adhikari et al. 2018 work?
Okay, that was a paper that came out in Earthquake Spectra. There's a special issue. They didn't publish a print issue. It's online only. Unfortunately, it's behind a paywall for the Earthquake Spectra, and I actually can't get behind the paywall myself because I'm not a member, but I do have a copy. So if you're interested, just email me. I'd be happy to send it to people.
Great, thanks. And like I said, Debbie Weiser asks, in the aftermath of an earthquake, how can scientists from other countries help and not hinder local scientists?
Boy, yeah, that's a big question, and it's tough. You have to find people and just understand, be partnering with local scientists and doing as much as you can to bring them along from the beginning. And Doug Given was my partner in crime for the site response deployment. And he was wonderful. He would, at the first opportunity, put the laptop into one of our partners' hands and say, okay, this is what you do. But there's a huge difference between that and doing everything with somebody looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think that's the end of all of our questions.
Thank you again, Danielle.
Yes, it's okay. Yeah, and it's 5 till the top of the hour, so this is perfect. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you so much, Sue, for doing the webinar. I know not kind of speaking out into the ether is a challenge. And stay tuned and this is recorded, so this will be up on our YouTube channel if you want to review some things again or look through it at any point. And stay tuned for our next month's webinar. I know Brandon Schmant is giving it, and Justin Sweet, another IRIS project associate, is leading that one. So stay tuned through the IRIS listservs, and we try to put things out to SCEC and UNAVCO as well. So just stay tuned for that information. And thank you so much, Sue, and thank you all of the attendees.
Thank you, Danielle, and everyone listening.
Yeah. All right, take care. Bye, everyone.